but it was somebody had brought to Nicole actually, and then we talked about it, that there were folks who didn't know where to find like reputable answers about COVID, that sometimes it felt like government press releases were coming out after the news had already broken. And so people just weren't quite sure where to get accurate, up-to-date information. And then there are also people who like don't read those reports very well, or medical journals, that they just like, there's a lot of jargon, a lot of acronyms and things like that. So that brought to me like, okay, what news sources are trustworthy? And then when I thought about that question, it was more of looking at how to read the news critically in general. And then that will help with COVID, and that will help with any sort of news really. So using COVID as an example, but this is gonna deal with first the baseline of just like how to be a critical news reader. So first, just kind of looking at, these are the different things that we'll look at, assessing different sources. So how do you get your news personally? Is a good thing to, if you haven't thought about that, if you haven't asked yourself that, definitely a good place to start. Is it through Facebook? Is it from a newspaper or TV? Or is it like more of a primary source, direct source? In this case with COVID, is it like, are you really reading from medical journals and press releases from like government sources, or from scientific agencies? And so with that, then what is your responsibility as a media consumer? There we go. So I first just wanted to address that even if you worked in health and public health, that there was just a lot of different words going on in this last year that was just going to make it confusing for everybody. Because at first it was coronavirus, and then it was SARS-CoV-2, and then it was COVID-19. And then when the variants came out, they were linked to the locations. And then that was kind of a PR nightmare, because it brought some negative, unwarranted attention, as if it was the fault of those countries for having those variants. And so there were lots of new words, and they changed throughout the year, right? And up until now. So words like, novel in this context of being a novel virus, words like asymptomatic. If you don't work in health, how do you know what that means? That kind of thing. And then I also noticed like there were so many people in charge, so many people that were telling us what was going on with the virus, and with testing, and with and then with vaccines. And so and then I even put in some acronyms on here, but just like there are acronyms galore. And so it was just a lot of information all at once. So it's, definitely good to take a step back even from what you're reading, and just to double check that you even understand who are the sources and what are the words that they're using, that kind of stuff. There are a lot of experts when it comes to something like this, and unfortunately not all of them agreed. So that also led to the confusion. So how do we tell that kind of stuff? So I brought up I found some headlines from, this is actually early in or I guess spring of 2020. These are from like April, May. And so I just wanted to point out a few things about these headlines. That is the first thing that you read, right? So a headline is actually really important to the story. It's supposed to tell you the, kind of the most important part of the article. It's supposed to tell you what you're going to get out of it. It does have to grab you. We're going to talk about clickbait later. But I just wanted to point out a few of these things. So the first one is a listicle, and this is from Vox. And so that is something that we would see a lot of, but it uses the word novel. And so if you're not aware of what that means, and they don't explain it in the article, then you might feel a little bit lost, or you might not click on it because you're like, I don't know what that means. The second one is actually a news release from the FDA, but it uses it's very long, and it uses some technical language, diagnostic, really. That's a little bit more technical than most news sources. So this is just an example of like what a press release might look like. The third one is CNN. It's a little bit of fear baiting. Worried about the coronavirus? Click this, read this. So just being aware of how they're getting you. The one under that, coronavirus updates, that one is a CBS headline, and it just uses the word fear in the headline. It also is putting it in the context of the economy, because there's a lot of different ways of looking at coronavirus and looking at this pandemic in particular. And then that last one is from Reuters, and that one is addressing the question itself, that it can be confusing on who to even look to. So just an example of some of our early headlines are in early news, and how just overwhelming that it could be. So I first want to look at media responsibility. Also, full disclosure, some of you know this or remember this, but I have training as a journalist. That's what I did in school. And then I worked in it for a little while. So we're going to talk about bias in a little bit. And so, I mean, full disclosure that my bias will be a little bit of wanting to defend what the media is trying to do in essence. And then it's obviously been, there's been some, essentially corruption. But anyway, so please call me out, or just ask questions if you're like, well, wait, you're being a little bit too nice on the media or something. And I hope that I'm not, because I'm very critical of I've tried to be very critical of it, but I also understand their side. I understand what they're trying to do, or at least individuals are trying to do. The corporations, that's a whole other thing. So yeah, media responsibility. This is a quote from a really good long article from the Washington Post, and it was about the lab leak. I got really stuck on the lab leak and was going to do a whole presentation just on that. And then I thought, no, that's getting away from the point. But that's an example of a pretty confusing narrative, the origins of the virus and how it's being reported. But I pulled this quote out in particular because I thought that it was really helpful overall, just that like, this story is new. There's going to be a lot of news stories. They're constantly, every day, every hour, every minute. So as with any story that's new and it's complex and it's evolving, conventional wisdom undergoes a metamorphosis as new information arrives, as it should. So early news organizations are trying to report accurately, but not trying to create panic. So that's something that I know was going on, and I don't know if it was really shared out, and not something maybe that it was kind of called out, but readers needed to know the answers now. No one had it, but then both the media and certain aspects of the science community and government are not trying to create a panic, but then are they having an underwhelming response? So their responsibility is trying to thread that line, walk that line, thread that needle. And so then we need to know how to take in what they're giving us and give it and be critical back and say, and that's gonna take time. We're 16 months or so after the real break, the first quarantine period, lockdown period, and there's still lots of stuff that we don't know, but it's hard because people want to know at the time, and it's something that no one may know, much less report on until very much later. And so it's just trying to find that balance. Sorry, just checking my notes. Yeah, so what I want to focus more on is our responsibility. So I want to say first, especially something like coronavirus, a lot of things in scientific science news, things that happen, breakthroughs, things like that, to set aside the expectations that what you're going to read are conclusive, permanent, and definite. They're not. So I think as soon as we put that aside, then we can be a little more understanding of what we're reading. The sources themselves will change and adapt as we want them to. I know that was a narrative that came out. I remember it from like last spring and summer, is that people that we would talk to, people we would interact with, be really frustrated when we would hear, oh, well, mask, all of the changes around should we wear a mask and when and for how long and all that stuff. I took it as, this is good, I want you to update me. But some people in just being very afraid, rightly so, of what was going on in the world, just were very tired of it not being something that they could point to and do that and do it for a long time. But when looking at how they're reporting on these kinds of things, that's when we can figure out who to trust, what to trust, and how to consume, and then how to process that information to make changes in our own life. So this was actually something that I found, doing my research from 1990, but man, is it applicable. And so, like I said, we're going to talk about bias a little bit, but important thing to remember. So, yep, the quote on the screen, the important thing to remember is that objective reporting is a myth, because every reporter's bringing to the story their own biases, their own worldview. They're making a choice in what to include, what to leave out, what sources to use. Few well-placed adjectives, use of the word alleged or so-called, that can really change the story that you're reading. I did want to make a quick note on the word alleged, just when it comes to criminal activity. Actually, as a part of like ethical guidelines for journalism, is if somebody is accused of criminal activity, either through actual courts or the court of public opinion, it is an ethical standard to use the word alleged until they're actually convicted. And so sometimes alleged is trying to be objective about the subject matter and about the crime and about the person. It doesn't always look that way, but I think it's also important to remember, if you're reading about something that's happening in courts, or if it's more like public opinion, I won't get into that stuff, but this is just getting into that objectivity, unfortunately, is just, you probably already know this, is just not going to happen in reporting, but we try, or they try. And so I'll come back to bias in a little bit, but first, wanted to continue to come back to your responsibility. So critical media consumer, a checklist. So some questions to ask yourself when you're reading basically anything. Who authored this? Why was it created? So if you're reading from something like the Washington Post, that's a reporter, that's their job. What other things are we reading? What are the source material? And then who is the author? A lot of times, if it's not a reporter, you'll get a bio at the end of the article, and that will tell you a little bit about their background. They may not always report everything that makes them, that really shows like their bias. But you're getting something out of that. And we'll talk about opinion as well, like opinion pieces. And then, why was it created? Is it entertainment? Is it to inform, or is it to persuade? You would think that those would be three separate things. I personally do like to be entertained when informed, but I want to, I want to know that that's what's happening, and I want to be able to tell that that's what's happening. But what's harder is the inform and persuade. And that's where that words like alleged or so-called that can really twist that the author is using to persuade you, but in words that you may not realize that that's what they're trying to do. They're coming at it with their own kind of agenda. Two would be, looking at the credibility of it. So just using basic critical thinking skills, but also looking for the support and the evidence they're using. Are they using statistics? Are they using, quotes, and from who? Are they the best news articles that I really like when it comes to specific things like reporting on COVID is I kind of want them to show their primary sources. If they're saying that they got this information from a report, I want to either have a link to that report, or I want them to make it so clear that I'm going to be able to Google it and find it. It's when they're really vague about how they got that information. And I can talk about background sources and anonymous sources if y'all would like. But in general, like looking at who are the sources. Is it a primary source, or is it a few degrees away from the subject? And of course, what qualifies the experts to be labeled as such? So just really asking those kinds of questions. Third thing to ask, is it biased? This is a trick question because it is. There's just inadvertent bias. But is the reporter trying to be as objective as possible? So does the story need an opposing viewpoint? Sometimes they don't. But if they do, is it present? Balance does not mean 50-50 when somebody is doing reporting. And oh, I don't think that I have in my notes an example of this, but if you're reporting on a situation and these guys like the situation and these guys don't, depending on what the situation is, they don't have to have 50-50 space in that article, right? Kind of depends on what the issue is. And then, yeah, what details were left out. And you will likely find out about what details are left out by number 4, cross-checking with other reports. So if you, it's a journalistic practice to go by the rule of 3. So if you are reading about a topic, find 3 different reports on it, find 3 different articles on it, and kind of cross-check who has the same base information, but what was left out of each, and can you tell why? Is it because it was geographic? Was somebody covering it from a national perspective, somebody else covering it from a local perspective? The local might have more direct community quotes or community information because they're right there, that kind of thing. So I also put in here that this, it practice like anything new, it's going to seem like a lot to ask these questions of every article. But like anything new, you kind of get used to it. And these kind of questions, it's almost like muscle memory. You're just trying to trigger your brain to, once you're reading something light bulb is going to go off and you're like, wait, there's something about this that is kind of funky. And you're going to reread it and be like, yeah, they left out this, or wait, I have this question they didn't answer. And so I want to go look for it again. So it's just like practicing. And yeah, you'll see differences reading the same topic from different places.
Meg, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about like looking at 3 different sources, 3 different articles, would that exclude ones that like reference each other?
That's a really good question. And I would say yes. Thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That's a really, really good point. Once you start to read news critically, you will see how many of them use each other. And so once you realize that, you're like, wait, who is patient 0? What is the originator of this information that, sometimes it's New York Times, and then everybody will take from the New York Times article and they don't do their own reporting on it. And that's a business model that they're like, we just got to get this out right now. So again, don't have to go into super detail about the business model of that unless you want me to. But yeah, I would say that if you're reading something and you look for a third, but it references the first, I would say, it doesn't mean negate that one, because there could be some really good information that, example, New York Times didn't have. But if you're questioning the base information the New York Times did and everybody else is just repeating it, that's a really good question to be like, where did the New York Times get this information? Did they cite their sources in a way? And if they didn't, that could just be I don't know. I think I should take this information with a grain of salt. Because unfortunately, it's not like you can necessarily email that reporter or whatever publisher and say, I have this question, can you answer it? The bigger places like that probably won't answer. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I would say that sometimes it's just going to be, I just don't know how much I don't know how much I can really trust this information. So I'm just going to grain of salt. I'm just going to keep my eye on it. It could just be a situation where not all the information is out yet. And so I just need to keep my eye on it, kind of thing. So yeah. Any other questions right now? I feel like I'm going pretty fast and I tend to talk when I'm a little nervous. So I talk fast when I'm nervous. So let me know. So this number 5, I'm a big fan of the gut check because I really think that intuition plays a part in all of this. So when you read this article, how did it make you feel? Did you feel satiated? Were you informed? Are you curious to learn more? Or did it just make you scared? Did it just make you angry? Well, of course, anger is not a terrible emotion that could drive you to action, but did the article not answer your question? Did it not answer what you wanted it to? Is a good question to ask yourself. Yeah. So yeah, I want to talk about clickbait. This is an example. You don't have to put it in the chat or answer it unless you want to, but of these two, this is the same. They're referencing the same report from the CDC. So NBC News is starting out immediately with there are these issues after people got the COVID vaccine. Or the second one is more about the report itself. It does not have quite a judgment yet on any of the details in the report. This is obviously not the worst clickbait headline that we've all seen. I mean, some of them are the ones that are like, you won't believe what she looks like now, and it has some doctored picture, and of course you want to click on it. But I think, I mean, this one I just pointed out because one of these two is much more measured than the other. And when you're looking for reliability or some trustworthiness in news, I just think that something that's a little bit more measured is you might get more of those questions answered, or you might be more satisfied with some of those questions. But trust, so how clickbait came about, trust in media has been declining since the 70s. Polarization is on the rise. Clickbait headlines are designed to get you to click. They are often, though, not a good reflection on what is the meat of the story, or the story itself is quite biased. Clickbait also arose out of kind of the business model. So sustainability for news has been on the decline since the rise of the internet, because loss of traditional revenue. People aren't buying ads in physical copies anymore. And then there's a lot more free stuff online. There's new free news websites. There's free ways to advertise. And so then, subscriptions declined. So that is what gave rise kind of to clickbait, is they need you to click on it because then they get revenue, and that's how they stay afloat. It's not the best, obviously, as far as a consumer point of view. But the opposite of a clickbait headline would be a solutions-based headline. And that one is, so this CDC panel to weigh youth heart risk is more of a neutral. If we're looking at it like that, the NBC one is a little more clickbaity. I apologize, I actually just realized I did not put in a solutions-based, but a solutions-based headline still has kind of a bias to it in the way that it is trying to say, this is an issue that's being reported on, and within the story itself is people are working on this issue. And so the headline then reflects that part of it, rather than the fear, rather than possibly exaggerating the problem. I don't think this NBC News is exaggerating the problem. I think they're just drawing attention to a problem immediately as a way to get you to be like, oh, I got to know about this. And you should know about this. But yeah. But I just also wanted to, in my research, I found something interesting, that a study was done that headlines that had more of a solutions based headline actually had more clicks than non-solutions based headlines. So we'll see how media changes if they start to change in that way. So the last big bit is social media. A lot of people get their news originally from Facebook, from Instagram, whatever the social media is. There are more people that do that, or they find it through a Google search, and then that takes them to to an article that they're looking for. They're looking for information and they Google it. Versus if you go to the news website itself, or a like a newsletter or something. But social media brings up its own really particular layer. If you read news via social media, it's already been curated. So really important to be aware that the person and their agenda that shared it, it's important to be aware of the agenda. And this doesn't have to be, not negative is not the right word, but even if it's intent, let me start myself over. I think that we have all come across that concept of like intent doesn't always matter. You can still cause harm even with good intention. And so it's just important that if you're on social media and you see an article, where did that article even come from, kind of thing. So it's important. I think that's just an important layer as you're asking those kind of critical questions. So like I follow a lot of my interests on social media, and they share articles and videos. And those things I may not have seen otherwise. I may not see them on mainstream sources. But it's important. I'm still aware of the kinds of media that they're going to share. So that I will still apply my critical thinking to the pieces that they're sharing. So, because there's nothing wrong with opinion, but it's important to know if what you're consuming is opinion and if it's agenda based, even if you agree, or if it's meant to be a more fact forward piece or something like that.
Meg,
Yeah.
I think I just might add, like you said, it's important to be aware of opinion, even if you agree. And I feel like it's important, especially if you agree, because it's so easy to be like, yeah, that's true, I agree. And like, even though it's opinion, kind of like take it as fact.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can really silo yourself, even if you don't realize it. That confirmation bias, that it works for it. I mean, everybody is affected by that. And so it's, definitely important to, I kind of had it a bit earlier. Yeah, just still keeping your mind open to different perspectives. That'll help broaden your own perspective, but it'll also keep you aware of potential bias. I also thought that I apologize. This was kind of a last minute ad because it was just one of those things that happens when you're resting your brain and it pops up, was the algorithms that happen with social media. So the more you might interact with something, the more then that social media itself, that the mindless machines behind our social media are going to have stuff pop up on your pages and things like that. So like just a small example, silly example, I was walking with a friend and I mentioned that the Black Widow movie was coming out, and she said, the what movie, the who, what? And she's like, I didn't see that at all. And I would like to see that movie. And I was like, that's so funny, because that's all I've seen, because I interacted so much with similar things that it just kept showing up for me, but did not show up for her. So just really depends on who you're interacting with, what you're clicking on. They keep track of it all. So just kind of a funny thing to remember, that what you're interacting with, your location, even all of that kind of gets factored in. So, and that some of that stuff is a little out of our control. So I had some, So what now? My first thing, I put read, but really just consume regularly. I should have put consume. I'll change the PowerPoint so that if we end up sharing it out to anybody, to just consume regularly. And obviously the stuff that you're interested in. I still think a wide variety will really feed that perspective, will really help keep you really informed. So local news, but national news, and then even other countries, but also topics that you're really interested in, travel and health and business. I'm personally a big fan of email newsletters. So I get dropped in my email every day. I get more than the average because of my past. And so that also keeps me so that I'm reading something from the Seattle Times and the Washington Post and other stuff. And I'm listening to it on NPR, all that stuff. And so I'm aware of how they're reporting on similar things, but in those different kinds of ways. And it can help answer the questions that maybe somebody else didn't, and make me aware of maybe their bias, like they're only talking to these kind of experts, whereas NPR is talking to these kind of experts. But it also, that means that I get as full a picture of the story as I can. Obviously that takes time. Starting out small, but starting with something that's not just Facebook, because of that social media layer, that agenda layer, that algorithm layer, just trying to go to a source on a regular basis. Yeah. I think the last thing I just wanted to add was the direct source obviously will have as little agenda, as possible, except for their own agenda, which you're aware of. But it can also be full of jargon, and sometimes it's just so focused that there's no context. And that's really what the news is supposed to do. They're supposed to be the middleman. They're supposed to have trained reporters that are asking questions for context and for clarity, and they're supposed to report on that to keep you informed. But we all know that we still need to hold them accountable to do this in that way that is as objective as possible, as honest as possible, and we can do that by asking kind of these critical questions. So that is, I've gone through mine. I'm happy to talk about the types of kind of stuff that I trust, that I like to read or like to consume. I'm going to put in a plug for subscriptions. That's how you keep places that you like afloat, unless you're clicking on all those ads. So if you like a news source and you want them to stick around, I mean, I'm also just a big believer in, if you like something, contribute to it. Yeah, any last or any other questions or thoughts or?